From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, and as you can hear, right now I'm deep in the Okinawan forest. Well, I wish that was true. I'm actually sat in the recording studio, and I've overlaid some sounds from the Okinawan forest. Because in this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Nick Friedman. Dr. Nick is a researcher in the Biodiversity and Biocomplexity Unit at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, OIST. He's particularly interested in the origins of biodiversity, how we get so many species, and how those species become so different. Right now, he's a part of OKION, the Okinawa Environmental Observation Network. They have a project to understand biodiversity on Okinawa, which includes the use of sound. And they do this using a clever combination of microphones, citizen scientists, and a supercomputer. In this episode, we talk about the OKION project, what it can teach us about biodiversity on the island of Okinawa, including human impact, and how the approach could be applied elsewhere. You'll also get to join us on a walk through the forest to hear some more of these so-called soundscapes in action. Moving away from island life, we also discuss urban environments and the impact of noise pollution on humans and animals living in cities. One thing to clarify, in our conversation on human impact, I mentioned an example of fish learning to jump out of water to catch pigeons. I looked it up, and it is true. In southwest France, a group of catfish have learned how to jump out of water to catch and kill pigeons. We are doing some strange things to animals. Anyway, this one was a lot of fun. Dr. Nick is great at explaining his work, and I loved having an excuse to be out in the forest, listening to the beautiful soundscapes that form the basis of some of his work. If the snippets in this episode aren't enough, you can check out the show notes for links to the full selection of Okinawa soundscapes on the OKION SoundCloud page. Without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Nick Friedman. Hi, Dr. Nick.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Tell us who you are and how you describe what you do.
So my name's Nick Friedman. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. And part of my research focuses on animal sounds and the soundscape as a whole, and how that reflects the sort of interaction between humans and nature.
So you're a part of the Okinawa Environmental Observation Network, and you have a project with lots of monitoring stations across the island. Can you tell us a bit about the project and its setup?
Sure. So OIST has so many different high-tech projects going on. We study various aspects of quantum physics. And so this seemed like a way to study something that was very accessible to Okinawan people. And that is Okinawa's natural environment. And so we have a series of monitoring stations across the island where we try to collect data on biodiversity. Okinawa is a really narrow island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In the south of the island, you have lots of cities. It's really densely populated. And then when you get further north, it's mostly these vast forests. And so the gradient between those, going from urban to suburban to rural, that provides a kind of natural experiment for biologists like me, where we can figure out what happens in that interaction between humans and nature at each step along this gradient.
And I definitely want to dive into what that looks like. These monitoring stations, though, what is the exact setup that you've got at each of these different points around the island?
Yeah, so at each of these points across the island, we have a insect net that catches insects and they fall into some alcohol. And we have a weather station to tell us about the climate. And then finally, we have these acoustic monitors. And what they do is they just record a snippet of sound 10 minutes out of every 30 minutes, cycling on and off throughout the years. So far, we've collected about 1 terabyte every week since we started this project. That's 1 terabyte of uncompressed audio. And after 2 years, that means we've collected about 100 terabytes of audio.
It's insane.
Yeah, it really is. And, there's various ways of humanizing that number. And, for example, you could have a stack of floppy disks that's 200 kilometers tall. But the one that I like is that if you wanted to listen to all these recordings, right now it would take you about 16 years.
So you've got to have some really exploited interns based out here working around the clock to crunch all of that data.
Yeah, so if we assume that we're doing things by reasonable labor standards, you're only working like 8 hours a day on this, then it's more like 60 years.
So that poses a bit of a problem for your work, or does it?
It does in some ways. I mean, I can't sit there and listen to everything, right? I maybe tried that for the first week and it drove me kind of nuts. So one of the things that we're trying to do then is we can take all of these sounds that we've recorded and sort of, you can imagine putting them in a blender and grinding them up. And what you get out is just the different frequency bands, the different pitches of sound that we recorded.
So you've got these different monitoring sites around the island. And as part of that setup, you're performing acoustic monitoring from these little hidden boxes. You or a member of your team then has to go out there manually to pull out some kind of SD memory card that's got all of that data on it, bring that all back, upload that to a computer, and then that's the point in the process at which some kind of automation allows you to crunch things in a more efficient way.
Yeah, right. We still have to go out to the field and we have to put some boots on, traipse around in some mud, get the SD card with the data on it out of there. Right now, there's just too much data we're collecting to push it through a cellular network. And so then we store that data on OIST's Sango supercomputer. And that's allowed us to analyze it at a much greater volume and velocity than otherwise possible.
Maybe we should go and grab some data to have a play around with.
Yeah, so let's go to the field, huh?
Let's do it.
So we're at a site now about 200 meters away from OIST campus. And you can still hear a little bit of construction in the background. But we're in the forest now, so you can also hear some of the animal noises that are going on. The high-pitched droning that you hear is some of these little platyplura cicadas. And so they'll be sitting on their trees, stridulating to make those sounds. We can also hear things like the Japanese bush warbler, which is a typical herald of springtime in this country, and some of these little Japanese white eyes, which make a lot of the high-pitched sounds you can hear in the morning. And I just heard a gecko. So this is sort of like a census of what's going on in the forest, right? What I've got in my hands here is a microphone that's designed for minimal power usage. And it's going to sit here in the forest for a long time, just recording natural sounds while there's no humans around.
It's heavy.
It's full of batteries, yeah, and it's got a little SD card that can hold about 0.5 terabyte. So I'm going to tie it to a tree here.
All right. Take nothing but photos, leave nothing but footprints and acoustic monitoring devices.
Okay, so it's sitting there, and it should have a pretty Oh no, there's ants.
Ants.
I hate ants.
Yeah, no. There we go. No ants.
No, actually, ants can be a big problem for this project because they are the only thing that's able to get inside and destroy this because it's waterproof.
But it's not ant-proof.
But it's not ant-proof because the ants will chew through the waterproof barrier and then the water will kill it.
It's vicious.
So what do you hear?
There was something just then.
So that's a Japanese bush warbler. So I can also hear Japanese white eyes brown-eared bulbuls, and maybe a Japanese tit.
Your ear is far more attuned than mine. I hear lots of beautiful sounds, but I suppose like an untrained machine learning algorithm, I have no context. And we're back. That was fun.
Yeah, it's always fun to get out in the field.
And the field part was definitely recorded in between the first part of this interview and just now.
Yeah, we would never think to do anything cheeky like recording it afterwards.
So a terabyte of audio data each week, totaling something in the region of years, that is just an unimaginable amount of labor for a person to perform. But you have employed citizen science and machine learning to make this crunching a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's right. So we use a kind of machine learning to recognize characteristics of each kind of animal's sound. And one of the things that we've been working with to crunch through this data faster in terms of training these models is using citizen scientists to identify what those animals are. And so the computer uses something called unsupervised clustering to pick out what it thinks as a computer, who knows nothing about animals, what it thinks are different species. And so I invited a bunch of bird watchers over to vote on what each species was that the computer had decided.
So you've got some people with a bit of technical expertise in that field already.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised. Some of these bird watchers are like 12 years old and they are ace.
So based on the different noise profiles that the computer is able to distinguish, those are then validated by citizen scientists to validate what it is that we're listening to.
Yeah, that's right.
And then over time, the machine learning algorithm is able to better detect what it's hearing without necessarily having to ask a citizen scientist to do the categorization.
Right. So instead of having to listen to 30 years worth of recordings, you can get the supercomputer to allocate a few hundred processors to that, and in a few hours it's done.
It's amazing. A really rich data set that you can then play with. As a quick aside that you might be interested in, my co-host was running a project back in the UK called The Plastic Tide, which basically involved flying drones around the entire UK coastline and taking pictures of beaches. It would then upload these to a website, and people would then tag the types of trash they could see in the images, whether it's a plastic bottle or a Coca-Cola can. And the algorithm was called YOLO, you only look once, so that eventually it would know what it was looking at without needing to get people to tag these photos. So I think, again, your project is a really great example of bringing citizens into meaningful projects that have a tangible, useful impact on them as a community.
Yeah, and maybe it tells us a little about how machine learning works as well. Like this kind of job, listening to thousands of hours of natural recordings, is really mind-numbing. And the computer is much better at it than we are. But it doesn't understand what it's looking at, right? It's just ones and zeros. So we have to give it the context to get the kind of answers out that we're looking for as scientists.
And what answers are you looking for, and what have you found?
So what I'm looking for is an understanding of how human-produced noise and other forms of human disturbance impact biodiversity across Okinawa, and what this can tell us in terms of some general rules about how biodiversity assembles.
And also maybe something about the outliers who are able to persist within urban environments too.
Yeah, that's right. And we should be, respectful that some species are using humans as a strategy to survive, a kind of urban strategy.
So beyond this proof of concept on the island of Okinawa, is there a possibility of bringing this technology to different places in order to study biodiversity elsewhere?
Yeah, I think this is a great tool that we can use for things like rapid biodiversity inventories, for tracing the phenology of ecosystems, so figuring out what their natural cycles are like, and also for monitoring in areas that are hard to reach using low amounts of manpower.
I'm just curious, to understand how we might look at the undetectable aspects of biodiversity within a soundscape. For instance, if some species are particularly loud and boisterous, I imagine there are some that go sonically undetected. So in terms of the picture that gives us overall, how do you overcome that limitation?
Yeah, I think it totally gives us a biased picture in favor of the animals that are the noisiest. But visual surveys give us a biased picture in favor of the animals that are most colorful, most obvious, that don't like to hide. And so I think used together, this can give us a kind of more comprehensive survey of biodiversity. For example, we have the Okinawa rail here on Okinawa. And this bird was discovered really recently in terms of bird taxonomy. It was discovered in like 1979. And people have been living here for a very long time. And this bird was never described. But then someone hit it with their car and sent it to the museum. And they said, oh, wow, this is a totally new thing. But actually, a recording of this bird already existed. Because this bird, it turns out, even though it's super cryptic, is extremely noisy. And so if we were using acoustic surveys, I think we would have found the Okinawa rail much sooner.
So one definite success story. Are there any interesting things that you've come across when reviewing these soundscapes? Anything unexpected?
One thing that's been unexpected for me is just how it feels to hear an animal approach very close, because the microphone, you see, isn't as threatening as a human. So animals will just come really close to it. They'll land on the branch next to it, that sort of thing. And hearing an animal pass by, it feels like you're part of something where you're not actually impacting the system you're looking at. It's been really special to hear, for example, a bird land on top of the microphone. It's like a bird landing on your head or something.
I understand you've also brought these soundscapes into the city for a talk that you delivered in Tokyo. And in contrast to the example you just gave of a bird landing on your head, I think cities are perhaps a place where those kind of soothing soundscapes are needed the most. But more broadly, when it comes to the study of sound in cities, I'm more familiar with research from a human angle in that it's becoming more apparent that people of lower socioeconomic groups are living in parts of the city that are subject to quite harsh levels of noise pollution. That noise pollution is correlated to several detrimental health conditions. The human impact in cities of sound pollution is very well established. I wonder if you'd be able to comment on the impact on wildlife within cities.
Yeah, right. So just like you said, noise pollution has these effects on humans. It's bad for our health. It's bad for our mental condition. And one other thing that it does is noise pollution from humans tends to be really low frequency. And so that's those like shushing sounds that you hear next to a highway, for example. And those low frequencies block out a lot of animal communications. So if you're an animal that signals at those low frequencies, you have to speak up. You have to make your voice a little bit higher so that other animals can hear you. And that may be actually sending a different kind of signal, right? Because that means, you sound smaller. Or maybe you have to put more effort into your voice in order to create that sound. So this can be something that stresses animals out. It's also something that can interfere with animals' ability to sense their environment around them. So when you are jamming lots of sounds like that, you're making it difficult for animals to detect predators that might be sneaking up on them. And this kind of thing might explain why cats are so good at hunting small rodents and birds in the city, because, there are so many noises around. A lot of the natural defenses these animals have are reduced.
We're doing some very bizarre things to animals based on our presence in cities. There was one example I saw of fish that had evolved to jump out of water to catch pigeons.
Really?
I'm gonna have to fact check that before that goes into the episode. But yeah, we're doing some very bizarre things to animal evolution by our very presence.
Oh yeah, the urban landscape is a really dynamic one, but there's a lot of energy there, and animals are still keen to get a hold of that. So I think they're going to continue to evolve to find their own niche within our society.
There you have it from Dr. Nick. I know that you have a former life as a field technician with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center in Jamaica and the Atlantic Bird Observatory in Nova Scotia in Canada. How does your earlier work on plumage relate to what you're doing now?
So the plumage of birds is one of the ways that they are able to communicate with each other. They use their bright feathers as visual signals to say, like, hey, get off my turf, man. And so
exactly like that.
And so for me, these vocal signals are another way that birds communicate. And this is all part of understanding how animal communication factors in with all the other ways that animals interact with their environment and how biodiversity is produced through evolution.
We usually like to wrap things up with a quick fire round.
Sure.
In a couple of words, how would you summarize what you do?
I study the evolution of animal communication and how birds in particular interact with their environment.
What emerging field in science or tech are you most excited about?
I think over the last few decades, we've figured a lot of things out about how to genotype animals, how to read their genetic code and understand what makes them tick. And I'd like to be able to collect more high-resolution data on the phenotype of birds. What can we describe about their shape, their color, their behavior, and then tie that into their genetics.
If you could wave a magic wand and correct a common misconception in an area of science, what would that be?
I'm an evolutionary biologist, so a lot of the misconceptions that I deal with when I'm teaching, for example, aren't misconceptions that are born out of just not knowing. But when it comes to things like human origins, that can be tied up in people's self-worth, how they define where they are in the universe.
He thinks we came from monkeys.
Basically, yeah.
Is there a tool that you work with that you particularly enjoy using?
I really like using my binoculars. I think that is the tool that has stuck with me. In fact, up until a few weeks ago, I've had the same pair of binoculars throughout all my field seasons and all my bird watching. And, I've seen a lot of really weird stuff animals do through those two lenses.
Humans included? Or
No, none of that.
Do you have a favorite science-related joke or fact you could share with us?
Yeah, so here's a good one. You take a bluebird, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what makes those feathers blue? Is it some sort of blue pigment in there? It's not. It's actually the way that the light interacts with those feathers. So if you grind them up, you will have a pile of gray powder, not blue powder.
And some kind of animal rights organization on your back.
Yes, no doubt.
Dr. Nick Friedman, where can people go to find out more?
You can go to our website, which is okeon.unit.oist.jp, or you can check out OIST's SoundCloud account, which has 100 soundscapes from Okinawa.
Dr. Nick Friedman, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. I'm your host, Chris Richardson. Our branding was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. That's soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.